Hello, Richard from budgetguitarist.com. It's been forever since I made a video, and a few people emailed me to ask if everything was okay. Yep, things are okay. Just been super busy with a million things, a bunch of family stuff to take care of. I got a new album I'm working on, and yeah, everything's good. So recently, U.S. Customs Department seized $18 million worth of fake Gibson guitars. So the fakes were shipped to the U.S. from Asia, and Asia has a lot of countries in it, but the vast majority of fake Gibsons come from China. So it's probably accurate to use the slang term Chibson for Gibson Les Paul made in China, fake. So it looks like a Les Paul, and it says Gibson on the headstock, and it can fool many people. There's a lot of videos about Gibsons. Some of them are complete firewood, and others appear to be fairly decent guitars, and then, everything in between. But I wanted to share some information with you about how Gibsons are made, how they cut some of the same corners that Epiphone does to make a cheaper guitar, but also why I personally prefer a real Epiphone to a fake Gibson. So Gibson is what's called an aspirational brand, right? That's marketing speak for something really expensive that people wish they could afford. Gibson charges premium prices because it's what people are willing to pay. But some of the processes that Gibson uses are time and labor intensive. Plastic binding adds to the cost of a Gibson Les Paul. It doesn't impact the sound, but it does impact the visual appeal. A Gibson Les Paul is not made in a cost-effective way. It's not meant to be cost-effective. It's a luxury item, so to speak. And it's meant to be made the way they made guitars back in the day, say the late 50s, for example. So the neck, for example, is made out of one big complete piece of wood. That includes the headstock angle. So it's kind of inefficient. Most companies, including Epiphone, use what's called a scarf joint, and it basically allows them to get two necks out of the same block of wood that Gibson would make one neck out of. Okay? It might be a slight oversimplification, but it's a reasonable description. Scarf joint is basically you cut a piece of wood at an angle and then you flip the piece around and you glue it on, and that's the headstock. So you glue it and you clamp it. So you might say a scarf joint is like used by companies to save money and make cheaper guitars, but that's not accurate. There are plenty of companies like Ibanez that use scarf joints on some of their most expensive guitars because scarf joints are very strong. They're actually stronger than using a single piece of wood like Gibson does for their Les Pauls. So why doesn't Gibson do scarf joints on their Les Pauls? Well, as I mentioned before, it's because they want to make those guitars the old-fashioned way, like they did back in the 50s. And it costs them more money, so then they get to charge more money. Why am I talking about scarf joints? Because it's one example that Chibson builders use to make cheaper guitars. Another example is the maple cap. So Gibson Les Pauls have a mahogany body and a maple cap. So the maple cap is like, in addition to being hard for me to say, it's about half an inch thick at the middle point, the thickest point, right? And then it tapers down. And that measurement's going to vary from one Les Paul to another. So they have the, card tops tapered down. But they use maple because figured maple is considered more attractive than regular mahogany. It enables Gibson to make pretty looking guitars. I do realize I'm holding an Epiphone right now, but it's the same concept. Many players believe that a maple cap contributes to the sound of the guitar, and we are not going to talk about tone wood today. You can watch some other channel for that debate. Chibson makers might use a maple veneer instead of a maple cap to save money. So a veneer is a super, super thin piece of maple, like the thickness of a poster board or even thinner. So you can get a ton of those out of a half-inch maple cap, and so it's a lot cheaper. And in some cases, they might actually use a picture, a printed color picture of figured maple that they can glue on the wood and then slap finish over. And sometimes if you look at it real quick, it can be hard to tell a picture from like a maple veneer. So Epiphone used a maple veneer on this Epiphone Les Paul and the other one I own, but on some of the more expensive Epiphone Les Pauls, they do actually use a maple cap. In terms of pickups in Les Pauls, I admit I have strong opinions, okay? I like pretty much every Gibson Les Paul pickup. But in Epiphone Les Pauls, I like the Probucker a lot, which this has. I don't like any of the other ones. Like the Alnico Classic, don't like them. Chibson guitars are likely to ship with generic crappy humbuckers, although, there might be some exceptions. Most covered and uncovered humbuckers, they look the same. And so that is an area where they can really cheat you. But I mean, if you're buying a Chibson, you're buying a cheap fake. You can't be really surprised if they give you cheap knockoff pickups. Now, to be fair, cheap pickups can sometimes sound good, but I've played more pickups than I can possibly remember over the past 40 years, and there really is a difference between a cheap humbucker and a good one. So we're talking about illegal products here. So the odds are increased that these guitars are made in some kind of illegal sweatshop, possibly with forced labor. When they come to the US, they can do a lot of damage by, flooding the market. The market gets flooded with fake guitars. People get ripped off. It hurts trust. Now, I've had some friends who've talked about how they'd kind of like to own a Chibson to hang on the wall. And they say, well, what's the difference between displaying a Picasso print versus displaying a fake Gibson Les Paul? I mean, personally, I think there's a big difference. Unless you're Bill Gates, no one is going to assume that your Picasso print is an actual Picasso painting worth millions, right? But displaying a fake Gibson is going to fool almost everyone, except for a handful of guitar players who are super knowledgeable. If you know what to look for, you can spot the fakes, right? It's not my job to tell people what's right and what's wrong, but I do think that people overestimate how important a headstock label is to other people. So I own 2 American-made Gibson Les Pauls. They're both Tribute series, but I also own 2 Epiphone Les Pauls. I've played this tobacco burst on this YouTube channel way more than my Gibsons. I've recorded with all 4 of them, and honestly, to me, they're interchangeable, except for my Gibson Les Paul with the P90s, because it's the only one with P90s. But I don't have any hang-ups about the company logo. I like Epiphone quite a lot, obviously. There's a whole psychology to people who buy like knockoff purses and other items, and I'm not going to get into that, but it certainly applies to people who want Chibsons to hang on their wall. And honestly, here's my pitch for getting an Epiphone instead of a Chibson, right? So your Chibson that you bought online might get stopped at the border, and then it might get destroyed. And now you're expecting the company that makes an illegal product to do the right thing and give you a refund. I mean, kind of rolling the dice. And if you do get your brand new Chibson, it could be a good guitar. It could be horrible. Could be anywhere in between. And you might be funding forced labor. When you buy an Epiphone, it's made in a factory by people who get paid, and they're there voluntarily, and it's overseen by Gibson because, of course, Gibson owns Epiphone. Actually, there's a cool tour of the Epiphone factory that you can watch online. It's really interesting. And your Epiphone Les Paul will be constructed exactly how they tell you. It'll have the exact pickups it's supposed to. And if you buy it from a reputable dealer and there's a problem, you can send it back. If you try to sell your Chibson Les Paul, you're selling counterfeit goods, which is illegal. And technically, the government can take your guitar away and destroy it. You might be in some legal trouble. If you try to transport it from the US to Canada, maybe you're doing a gig, customs officers can take it, and you could be in some trouble. If they know what they're looking at. Again, roll the dice. For every story of someone getting a good Chibson, there's a dozen horror stories about somebody getting a piece of crap. Add it all up. And here's my suggestion. If you really, really want a Gibson Les Paul, save up about $1,000 and go buy a used Gibson Les Paul Tribute. It's not going to have plastic binding, but it will be a real Gibson Les Paul. Or, just buy a new or used Epiphone Les Paul. Same great looks, with the right pickups, 90% of the sound, and with the right setup, plays great. Thanks for watching. And I will see you again some future Friday at 5.